Now, I'm going to start this video out by just giving you what I believe is the quick and easy answer to the question posed in the title, before then going on to explain it more thoroughly. And what that question, of course, is why does The Mandalorian work so well? Why do so many fans seem to enjoy it and have no sort of problem with it, whereas with the sequels, they didn't work so well and many fans have all sorts of different issues with those movies? And the simple answer is the sequel trilogy tried to greatly expand the story of Star Wars, bringing all sorts of new ideas and concepts into the mix, but it did it in a way where most of it comes off feeling like it falls outside of what you might call already established boundaries for the universe. But The Mandalorian, on the other hand, doesn't try to expand the boundaries as much as it explores what's already within them, which sounds very similar to the sequels or what they did, but it's actually quite a different approach. Basically, The Mandalorian feels like it's only exploring hidden and unknown corners of the galaxy that have always been there. It's showing us things that neatly fit within what's either already been established, or that just makes sense or aligns with what we already believe to be true about this fictional universe. And perhaps the best way to begin to explain further what I mean is to take a quote from the book Story by Robert McKee, where he said, "We give the fantasy author one giant leap away from reality, then demand tight-knit probabilities and no coincidences after." And of course, what he means by that is that when a fictional story begins, we, the audience or the reader, will accept any and all rules that the author or storyteller wants to lay down about their world, no matter how out there or crazy they might be. However, once those rules are established, once we know how things work and understand the basics of this fictional world or universe, we don't want anything to come along that just blatantly breaks those rules without giving us a hell of an explanation as to why, or else it ruins our immersion or belief in this universe altogether. And so for a lot of Star Wars fans, something like the Holdo maneuver, for example, is outside those initially established boundaries, especially when you consider the first Star Wars movie, the very first story we ever got in this universe, is all about having to find and retrieve a set of plans in order to plot an attack against a giant weapon. But then later on in the very same story, we'll learn you can just use hyperspace to destroy a giant ship, or multiple ships even. And so we look back and wonder why they didn't do that with the first Death Star, or the second one even. Why didn't they even consider it, even as a last resort, which many say is why Holdo did it, as a last resort. We suddenly have a break in the logic of the whole story or fictional universe. We have something that makes us question so many previous events, whereas before we didn't have to wonder about that. We could just assume that, for whatever reason, something like that simply wouldn't work, that hyperspace does not work that way. That when Han talked about the dangers of it in Episode 4, those dangers were solely for the vehicle and the people within it traveling through hyperspace, fly too close to a star, and perhaps you'll be ripped out of hyperspace and instantly vaporized by said star. Not that if you don't carefully plan your route, you may fly through a planet and destroy the whole thing. This is also the reason why so many fans rejected midichlorians being introduced in The Phantom Menace. They felt like they completely contradicted or broke the rules of the Star Wars universe that we learned about in the original trilogy. I mean, the Force is initially presented to be just this mystical energy field created by all living things that binds the universe together, not something generated by microorganisms living in cells. Not that that's what they actually were, but many mistakenly believed them to be generating or creating the Force in Episode 1. Even still, even though they're just a part of the Force, they don't exactly feel like something that fits or gels with what we learn about the Force in the original trilogy, where we were very much given the impression, again, that the Force was completely mystical and beyond being quantified. But thankfully, in regards to the Force, that's about the only thing that we could consider outside of the box in the prequels. Because even though in the original trilogy, we don't see the Force used all that much in the first place, and when we do see it used, it's rarely in a truly impressive or incredible way. Palpatine's lightning or Yoda lifting an X-Wing out of the swamp are probably the most impressive things we see. The fact that we see it used far more in the prequels doesn't conflict with the original trilogy because, first of all, there are a heck of a lot more Force users around during this time, which we knew would be the case going into it, since we learned in the original trilogy that Vader had hunted down and destroyed the Jedi. Furthermore, even though, yes, we do see it used more often, we never see the Force used in a way that greatly contradicts with how we saw it used in the original trilogy. The Jedi of this time are not running around all using crazy new abilities that make what we saw in those first 3 movies sad and pathetic by comparison. Even though I think we would be willing to give at least some leeway here, we would have been okay with seeing a few new abilities or powerful uses of the Force, considering the Jedi, or so we thought they would be, are at the height of their power at this time. Nevertheless, the prequels, or the way the Force is used and the power level we see of it, are very consistent with the original trilogy. Yes, again, we had the introduction of the midichlorians, which you could argue wasn't needed, and in all reality, they add nothing necessary to the story, other than perhaps hinting at Plagueis using them to create Anakin, which, yeah, is or could be a big deal. Anyway, taking them out really doesn't change much, if anything at all, but as we now know, in Lucas's version of the sequel trilogy, he would have gone much more in detail about the midichlorians, the wills, and the microbiotic realm. And though that all certainly sounds out of line and out there when compared to what we learn about the Force in the original trilogy, something tells me that if Lucas had gotten the chance to do his sequels, the Force itself, how it's used, would have remained consistent in the sequel trilogy compared to the previous two trilogies, But in the sequels we did actually get, that's really not the case. In those movies, it feels like the dial on everything related to the Force was cranked all the way up. And again, whether people who don't like them realize it or not, or can pinpoint it or not, I think it's one of the main things that's very off-putting about those movies. In the upcoming book called The Star Wars Book, which is basically just a giant encyclopedia, we learn, or have it confirmed, that Snoke is indeed a test tube baby, that he was created by Palpatine in a lab, and is called a genetic strand cast, that he apparently didn't know who or what he was exactly, or where he came from, and that he sort of had free will, yet also did Palpatine's bidding. And the very first question that popped into my head after reading this was, what's the point of Darth Vader anymore when you can make something as powerful as Snoke in a lab? Why did Palpatine only make something like this after he came back from the dead? Why did he bother with apprentices and the rule of two if he could make an army of Snokes, or even just one of them? And yeah, I get it. We see in The Rise of Skywalker a vat of failed Snokes, I guess, which means it's not easy to create. But just this very idea that you can create a powerful Force user and that he comes that way right out of the box, if you will, it just feels so out of whack with everything that came before in the story. It takes away from the story of Anakin, how he either was created by the Force, or maybe partially or entirely created by Plagueis or even Palpatine, and makes the whole thing, his whole story, feel lesser if you can just make something like Snoke. And don't get me wrong here, because I absolutely do think the sequels should have and could have expanded on the lore of Star Wars in a truly positive and meaningful way. And not to sound like I'm totally contradicting myself here, but the fact that they failed to expand on the lore is one of the biggest problems with the sequels. Because yeah, they do add new things, but again, they're things that don't align with what came before and feel like they fall well beyond the pre-established rules of the universe. Whereas again, going back to The Mandalorian, it's adding to the lore in a way that feels like it aligns with what came before. It feels like it's unveiling instead of just creating new stupid stuff. It also gives us the vibe that the Force is this very mysterious thing again, and that the Force users are rare and not widely known about, even though, yeah, I'd argue some characters seem a little too oblivious to the Force and the Jedi, and maybe they shouldn't be. Still, The Mandalorian comes off feeling like a genuine part of Star Wars, like it explores set boundaries of the universe with a character like the Child, for example, but it doesn't push beyond them and create new boundaries in the same way a character like Rey or Snoke does in the sequel trilogy. And really, once you breach those boundaries, once you break your own story's integrity, a lot of people will stop caring or being interested. Because even though, yeah, we know these stories aren't real, we do like to believe they are. We like to immerse ourselves in them and believe in a different reality for a little while, but that's hard to do when it can't even get its own set rules or parameters right. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Is the reason, or one of the reasons, why The Mandalorian works so well because it stays within the boundaries of Star Wars that have always been there, and that it brings the air of mystery back to this franchise? Or maybe is it something else altogether, or are you not that big of a fan of it in the first place? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.